Hello, and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we are beginning our discussion on Some Are Always Hungry by Jihyun Yun. For this opening discussion, we will be focusing on Jihyun Yun and the major themes and connections we've made about the debut collection.
So I want to welcome back everyone to this new year of books we're going to be talking about. We want to give a shout out to some of the countries that have picked us up. We keep getting notifications from all parts of the world. So whether you're in Asia or the Middle East or Latin America, we want to welcome you. And we love that you are listening to us and hopefully picking up these books, learning a lot from them, and sharing them with your loved ones. It's a new year, so new books. This first book, like Vanessa was saying, is one that I discovered on Twitter. So I discovered the writer on Twitter, and I really was always looking forward to this collection when it came out last fall. Originally, we had planned it for last fall, along with Thrown in the Throat by Benjamin Garcia. But, due to some issues last semester, we weren't able to get to it. But we're starting off the year with this one. And so we're going to have a couple more episodes on this one. Just want to open up the discussion here by talking a little bit about the offer and the book. So this is a book that came out late last year, as I mentioned, from University of Nebraska Press. This is Jihyun Yun's debut poetry collection, like Vanessa was saying. She's a Korean-American poet from California. Fulbright scholar. This book won the Prairie Schooner Prize in 2019, and I think we can all definitely say that it's a worthy recipient of that prize. We're going to get a little bit into it, but for the most part, we want to provide that overview as we do with our first episodes for the books that we cover. Was there something else that you all wanted to add about this collection before we get into the specifics?
Well, I just kind of wanted to mention that towards the back of the collection, she has a page where she mentions all of the places where some of these poems have been published previously, originally. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's really interesting because it's a whole list of the poems that have been previously published in other journals and such.
That's crazy. That's exactly what I was going to mention, Vanessa.
Wow.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to mention that too for anyone listening, and especially for anyone starting out too and looking into publishing, that this book didn't just happen. Many of the poems in this book, she had already sent out and had been published in a variety of other places. And in fact, they were even different versions of them, and originally published under different names. So I think, life as a writer, that's something that I think some people don't really think about right away, but it's a good start right away. It's just sending out individual poems and then works out to journals and reviews. And so I really love that this was included, the acknowledgements at the very end of the book. And there's some cool notes. I was kind of interested to see that one of them was even turned into a short film. But that's so cool that you thought you were thinking the same thing, Vanessa. But yeah, so this is just a shout out for anyone listening. Submit your stuff, work first, because I think a lot of people always kind of want to try and run before they walk, and I'm going to publish my book, but sometimes just get your stuff out there little by little, and then that book will take shape. Anyway, I'm looking forward to talking about the book. It's awesome.
Yeah, I think it is always nice to kind of read the acknowledgement section. In this one, she also mentions the Fulbright program, where it allowed her to, research in South Korea. She also mentions that, there's some translations that she got some help from notes that were addressed to her grandparents. It's just so much work. You can see so many people that she has worked with that have been mentors to her or friends, so that's always great to see, because I think the poet community, I think obviously it's a lot harder right now because we're like just virtual, but it's always great to see these poets do their readings live, like at AWP or, just open mics like you have, Richie. And like you said, just kind of publish little by little, and before you know it, you have a collection. And, I remember we talked about that a lot with Greece as well. So, this is a book that she dedicates to her mother and hers. So right off the bat, this is a book where we can we learn a lot about what family means. There's a lot of epigraphs as well, not just the opening epigraph that encompasses the whole collection, but epigraphs, in some of the other poems. What did you all want to say about what struck you about the collection just as a whole? Your first impressions.
Vanessa, I'm always going to let you go first, by the way. So,
okay. Well, I think going back to like the dedication, that really emphasizes one of the major themes that I think is throughout the collection. The emphasis of women and generations of women, specifically like the matriarch in Korean culture.
Yeah.
So this one really left an impact with me, as I think a lot of poetry often does. I absolutely love poetry, for one, and so what this collection brought were a couple things, which was not just an emotional impact. There were some heavy things here, some violence and some visceral stuff that just kind of I'm not used to reading in something like this, and it definitely was intentional, obviously, and not for it had a reason for being like that. On top of that, I always appreciate being able to pick up on all sorts of different new things from literature, from poetry. And so I was able to learn a lot of cultural things about some specific types of food, and even some technical terms. I think she had some titles that are based off of like the diptychs and obods. Like these are all kind of references to kind of themes and structures, and overall I thought it was a nice blend of poetry that I think is good, is easy to read, but also says so much. And I teaching, when I teach poetry, I like to point at a lot of what she's doing here. She's packing images together, and her use of techniques like enjambment, are, I think, pretty prominent in some places, and even anaphora, the repetition of phrases. And I can't wait to dive into some of these.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, Richie, we try to always talk a little bit about how to teach a work, right? And I think that's definitely one of the things that jumps out at me is that, when teaching poetry is hard enough, right? Because, as I always like to say to my students, poetry is as dense as, Thor's hammer, right? Mjolnir, or whatever it's called. And so they really have to dissect it. In this case, it's not just about the the specific, poetic elements, but what students would learn about Korean culture, how rich it is, how intertwined it is with food, the way that Young is able to write about food as well, right? Because it's a very, she writes about food in a way that is beyond its consumption. It's something that comes alive in different ways, like you said, that are violent, but that are also salient, and just how it connects with family, and so in many other ways. So that was my first impression.
I want to also include world history a little bit, and diaspora as elements you can draw out as teaching moments. You can learn a little bit about that if you haven't known some things. That's so vague, such a vague question, way of saying it. But if you're not too familiar with maybe Korean diaspora, you learn a little bit about maybe some of the history of colonialism and immigration there. So
definitely, I think in a post-colonial classroom, this would fit in perfectly. As also just talking about immigrant narratives. Talking about like you mentioned, right? I mean, just the way that you're able to teach about Korean history, right? And like we were talking about pre-show, you learn things that the way that the U.S. education system is, right? You don't really learn that much about Korea or Asia for that matter. So whether it's the Korean War or the Japanese occupation of Korea, there's a lot that of allusions that students can pick up on, and thereafter learn to appreciate the poem in a different way.
Yeah, man, right on.
And so there's 36 poems. Before we get to the specific or strong lines, in our next episode for the first half, Vanessa, what were some of we kind of already referenced them, but just to lay out the cards of the themes that we kind of picked up on from the collection, what would you say they are?
I think immigration is a big one that we mentioned, Richie mentioned a little bit earlier. Food and culture, and as one kind of thing. Sacrifice, I think, is another big one. And just women and their role in, I guess, the family.
Yeah, for that last one, Vanessa, could you expand on that one in particular? Because I think that one, is one that definitely, is one of the strings that ties the poems together, right? Is, womanhood, right? So what did you get from that?
I think a lot of it is I think it's a lot of the matriarchal, I guess, aspect that they have.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to Hispanic culture, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's also there's a lot of references of young girls and just them becoming mothers. There's a lot of emphasis on the different generations and how they come together, and how the younger generations will look to the older generations and see kind of what they've been through.
Mm-hmm.
I guess generational trauma kind of comes into it also.
For sure.
And I think also memory is a big one. For example, some of the poems are recipes, and she talks about the recipes of how to make these foods but also ties it into her memories of when she was making the foods.
Nice.
Yeah, I don't know.
Cool.
No, yeah, I think you did an awesome job of capturing some of that. And yeah, just like you said, I myself really enjoyed those recipe poems that you mentioned, because, it takes it takes this, Young takes this technical, piece of technical writing that is a recipe, right? That can be, just very formal. And then, like, even though you get the actual recipe in there, right, whether it's war soup or what have you, as it's mentioned, just the title itself, right, already tells you something. But, you get into the actual instructions and it's throwing in things there, right, about, like you said, how it's passed down from generations before, how it's kind of, going a little bit into like assimilation, right? Mentioning America, or the way that immigrants, immigrant communities see that particular dish, right? And of course, there's a lot of like Netflix shows about food and its ties to immigrants out there, right? That it kind of reminds me of. But yeah, I really like what you said there also about, the use of memory and we can maybe talk a little bit about that in relation to like some connections we made as well. But Richie, were you going to say something?
Oh no, I was just like, praising in the background, like, oh yeah, that's right, hallelujah, amen.
Yeah, I mean, and like you were saying, Richie, pre-show, right, is like, just like we taught our students, right, to keep a dictionary handy, like, looking up these words, right, looking up the references, here where we are in El Paso, right, there's a small, I guess, Asian community, right? We get like a lot of that downtown with the businesses there. But otherwise, we don't really learn too much about it, right? And so, that's one of the reasons why, I think for teaching this, it really kind of lends itself to the telling students, that they need to have that dictionary with them. And, because sometimes, of course, they think they can just kind of understand it as is. But, it's definitely one of those books that not only in her mastery of the way of the poetic voice, but, the richness of its description, it's very, the imagery is all over the place, right? In terms of how it's able to tie in, the speaker to their community, to their family, to Korea itself. It's just amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she in terms of technical, I guess in technical terms, her language, she's working with a diverse palette. She's working with that 300 Crayola box set instead of the 6, and so you get to use particular language. I guess you could say the specificity to describe something is really awesome to experience.
Yeah, I like that. And I think, I don't know if you mentioned this right now or in the pre-show, right? But you mentioned that, like, the poem called Recipe that talks about how her grandma was speaking in Japanese, right? And so, would be so cool to kind of teach that with students in terms of how, Korea was occupied, right, by Japan, for 1910 to 1945, as I read about, and, I'm not a big history buff, right? But I love when you can teach history through narrative and through poetry. So, yeah.
Fish. That's Recipe. Yeah, that's the poem Recipe. That's right.
Yeah.
And that's cool because I can't wait to talk about that one, just because there's also talking about language, and this language about food, and she brings up some very cool, interesting concepts that are worth talking about.
For sure.
Sorry for the noise in the background, by the way. I got people chopping down a dead tree. A neighbor's doing it, but it's pretty loud.
Well, I prefer this tree that I'm holding right here. You know.
Oh man, good segue.
That's corny, but yeah, I mean, I guess we could talk a little bit about the connections we made to whether it's popular culture or other works. I'll go first. For me, there's this show on Netflix called Kim's Convenience. I don't know if you all in the audience have seen it or heard of it, but it's about a family of Korean immigrants in Canada. And I've learned so much about Korean culture by watching it, even though, of course, it's comedy. You learn a lot about. That's actually where I learned some things, that I didn't know, and it's hilarious. It's a kind of pick me up show if you ever are feeling down, and from all this isolation, right? So I would personally recommend that one, just because of. I think we've talked about it before, right? But the need for the diverse and fair representation of immigrant communities and immigrant cultures.
Yeah, man. Great. And I have that right on my queue to watch right after this episode.
And they're super short too. They're like 20-minute episodes or what have you.
Yeah. It's a great title.
Yeah. What connections did you all make to pop culture or other works that we've covered?
I think Greece's collection, Girl, is definitely one of them. I want to say Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club, but I can't pinpoint why. I feel like they kind of connect to each other.
I think food, there's the kind of immigrant culture that is represented in it. And I think food is one of the ways that it, Ben does so. Mm-hmm. Who, by the way, he posted that, this kind of random, but he posted that the sequel to Aristotle and Dante's coming out this year, I think. So that's something to be on the lookout for.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know if it was food. Sorry?
No, I was saying, all right, 2021, looking up.
Yeah, already.
Yeah, I was thinking on that note on food. Yeah, there's definitely some elements of I think you see it in Science's book. Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club, of healing. Can't remember the stories right, but you do see it in a couple of them. And I think there's off the top, I think there's in this story, there's I think I love the title. My grandmother thinks of love while steeping tea. It's just kind of how we use food for each other as well.
And hunger, right?
Yeah,
because we haven't mentioned this, I think, for, right now, but 46 is the title poem, just like with Guatlica Girl, right? Some Are Always Hungry is the title poem kind of in the latter half of the collection. And it's it does represent hunger as obviously very metaphorical, right? And so yeah, I don't know if it was that, Vanessa, because we kind of took it that direction, or if there was something else from Ben Science.
I definitely think it's food, and then just immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Also, but then also Citizen Illegal, probably with food also.
Mm. No,
and I was tying it into culture. Sorry, go ahead.
No. You know how hard this is, when we do this virtually, where I can't see if you're going to talk, but
yeah.
Violence against women, maybe.
Yeah.
What other connections either of you did y'all have?
diaspora, like language, like the language of homeland, I guess, from your ancestors. That
Yeah.
definitely is in quite a few of the books we've read. Thinking
Yeah.
of Randy Rubai too, like
Mm-hmm.
going home, and in many instances here, she's a girl in California, thinking of home, of Korea, right? Her family's homeland,
Mm-hmm.
and like I guess how through generations you there's a lot about speaking it as well, and so she's doing a lot of reclaiming of it too,
Mm-hmm.
and not just the language but the food, right? It always comes back to the food.
Yeah. And I don't know about y'all, but I've as I get older, I'm already gonna be 40 soon. It's you really do learn to like appreciate so much about, like you were saying, Vanessa, the matriarchal culture, how like generations pass down these recipes, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely something that I become more mindful is because that like they didn't write it down anywhere, right? It's just like passed
Mm-hmm.
down by word of mouth. Um, so I think there's something to be said about her being able to record these things, and turn it into a whole other thing. You mentioned intergenerational trauma, and I can't help but think of Gali's collection, Sabrina and Karina, too, because it also
Mm-hmm.
deals with womanhood, right, and violence against women as well.
Right. Yeah.
This is like you were saying, Richie. You mentioned the diaspora. Was there other connections, like from other works you all have read beyond our podcast uh, books?
There is one poem later on in the book. I think it's like the longest one, and I think she just has. I mean, they're just like references to books. Like I mean, like someone who reads might have in their bookshelf.
Mm-hmm.
Was it The Sorrows of Young Werther and Herman Hesse? So the author Herman Hesse, I think she references
Mm-hmm.
as well. I don't know if she has too many pop culture references.
Yeah, I
Not that
think
I can
that's
think of.
right. I mean, I think that's definitely a good contrast with like Citizen Illegal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't know if y'all are listening out there teach like the comparison and contrast essay, but it's definitely something that I think students benefit from because of how they're able to discern differences and see why differences matter. Um, and also just as an art form, right, is like, what does it mean for a poem to rely on, on more of a cultural allusions, right, than like popular culture?
Yeah.
So that could be a whole other discussion, right, of like, of those kinds of things.
You did mention her use of epigraphs in the poems themselves, and so if anything, I do think that she draws from very interesting sources. For one, I was kind of impressed to see Reddit referenced in this collection. She references a subreddit, and so if you're not familiar, Reddit is essentially message boards, and a subreddit is based around a particular topic. In this case, she references one called brain cells, which I guess is related to incels, which is pretty terrible thought, like I guess group or idea in its own right. And then I think she even references the Texas Medical Association or Texas State Medical Association, like a reference from transactions. I thought were kind of interesting jumping off points for her for these poems she's referencing or that she leads into.
For sure. Yeah, I forgot about that one, Richie, but thank you for mentioning it. I think it's definitely, a poem that I want to talk about when we get to it, in terms of how it kind of, it's kind of like a response, right, to that particular epigraph. And like you said, that subreddit in general of what you said, incels, right, that kind of culture of, very, anti-feminist, you could call it, right? And misogynist. So yeah, there's definitely that one. And, there's a lot of, like I had mentioned this, the kind of personification, or maybe what you called it, Richie, like humanization of animals, whether it's chickens,
Pigs.
or pigs, right? It's just a really interesting way of showing, the way that the animal is represented, right? And really takes it into another level, that I think I think especially for like a class that is specifically looking at how animals are represented in fiction or in poetry, I think would be interesting to look at, because of normally if like even a creative writing class, right, and you have students kind of think about use an animal in a poem, right? It would just be a really good examples here of like how Young is able to represent animals in so many complex ways. There's also a little bit of the collection that besides family, I think it also goes into like relationships, right? And love, and maybe like even like abusive relationships as well, right? But I think it's definitely something we'll get to in the next episodes. But just wanted to mention that I was just kind of flipping through the pages and was reminded of several poems that kind of go into that. And also, Vanessa, you had already brought this out as a theme, but I was thinking of like maturation for women, right? Of how they kind of become, go from being that transition of, from a girl to a woman, and what that entails.
Mm-hmm.
I would be remiss not to mention also the cover. I kind of wanted like to make it a habit of talking about the covers. What do y'all think?
Oh man, I love that we talk about the covers because they're always awesome. But it's funny. Like, I always think about the phrase "don't judge a book by its cover." So in our show, like this is the section, the subsection, right? All right, time to judge the book by its cover. I'm kidding. I always love colorful title works like this.
Mm-hmm.
This it's leaves or umbrellas. What is?
They're fans. Like,
yeah, I'm a fan of it. I'm a fan of it.
I was thinking of like, it kind of brings to mind like the ocean and like seashells, and because a couple of the poems you mentioned, like that one you mentioned, Richie, benediction, as distinct cuisine on page 50, the ending, let me suck meat off the shell of every animal you won't eat, give me refuse and I'll make it worthy. Such a powerful ending. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting how it's got the speaker facing the wall, right? And that's kind of an interesting pose, how she's kind of in the background there instead of the foreground.
Well, actually, this title makes me think more of the poem "The Leaving Season," where first of all, I kind of love. There isn't a whole lot of humor in the book, but I think this one did make me laugh a little bit. The way she describes this guy trying to like impress her and say like just very obvious things. But she's interested in the women or the people going around and picking up like shellfish and stuff. But I think that poem ends with her walking into the sea.
Right. For sure. It reminded me of The Awakening, and like, there's a Nine Inch Nails song that kind of reminded me of it's kind of similar in its function. Since we do kind of, I know that there's playlists, right, for some of the other writers. So it'd be interesting kind of seeing what the playlist like this would be.
Oh. Huh. My mind's going places. That'd be a cool like a way to like listeners. If you guys are reading this, what would you include in the soundtrack? And you should send us a recording of what you think it should be, or like contact us in any way.
That'd be so cool. Getting like a mixtape, you know?
Yeah. So crowdsource a playlist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the other thing I wanted to mention, you know, before we close this this intro episode of ours is Jihyun just had a reading. So, you know, if you see her on Twitter or Instagram, you know, she's got she's got a YouTube reading that she did as part of I think part of Pigeon Pages, you know, so there were other readers besides her, but it's recorded on YouTube if you all want to catch that. You know, I think she's had other readings too. So, you know, it's one of the cool things about this virtual living that we have, right? Is we are able to partake of these. So, if y'all want to keep an eye out on that, you know, for our next episode, we'll be looking at the first half of this collection. So, hope y'all, you know, are able to pick up a copy as usual. But did you all have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I was gonna add that we could make this like on Spotify, we could make playlists and then just include them like as a link somewhere. Because if you can make the playlists collaborative, and so anyone that has the link can add songs to it.
Cool.
Yeah, that'd be cool to share on Twitter.
Yeah,
and I guess you could link it too on Instagram. I guess
so.
Because you got the Linktree, right? You can add the link on Linktree.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know you could do that. But yeah, I know, like I said, you know, we've been getting some from like Sylvia and Kali. So yeah, I mean, we should do that. And, you know, I'll add that. I'll add that 9 Inch Nails song for sure.
It's a really fun.
Called,
what's that?
It's called La Mer, I think, the sea. I can't remember it too well, but
yeah. And I guess to kind of transition and just again talk about like the actual application like for this, because it's first of all it is fun. That's one of the reasons to do it. But as you know, teaching a book, I think as an assignment, having students come up with a playlist around the work is not only fun, but I mean it kind of asks you to think about common themes and different themes, and I think that there is value in that. You can do a lot of it.
Yeah, that's actually one of my assignments, broadly speaking, in that like they have to make those connections in the comparison and contrast essay. But I know that specifically like Liz Acosta, she has an assignment like that, right, Vanessa? Something like that, where like you have to make a playlist based off like, I think it was Frankenstein, right? But I'm assuming she does it for like other works too.
I didn't do that in her class, but I think Yasmin also does
something like that.
Yeah.
Nice.
Cool.
Yeah. In undergrad, you know Angel, Jorge,
right?
Jose Angel, but I remember we were both taking a British lit class with Dr. Jai Surya, and for our final essay, I think we were competing for the highest grade in the class, so we were always trying to one up each other. And so this wasn't even I don't think this was even part of the assignment. We ended up making like a playlist for the book we wrote our essay about and turned it in with the essay. And I think she's kind of mentioned it in classes afterwards, like, oh yeah, this is a thing. So it it made me enjoy the work too a little bit more while doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's all verse, you know, at the end of the day. And yeah, so if you listeners out there want to keep an eye out on our link tree, which is on our Instagram, we'll have a link there for a Spotify playlist that'll be collaborative. So if you want to add some songs, Young, if you're listening in particular, you know, you of course have first dibs on that. But any listeners out there, you know, that have read any of these poems, you know, like we mentioned, you know, some of these have been published in some other publications and maybe different versions of them as well. So even if you don't have the collection yourself, see if you can find any of these, or maybe, you know, check out that YouTube reading of hers, and we'll get some tracks.
Thanks for joining us for this opening discussion of Some Are Always Hungry by Jihyun Yun. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy and share it with a friend. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.